Oh no, it is hot in here. I should turn the temperature down. Oh look. Now I feel better. Throughout the history of this planet, there have been countless natural disasters that have changed the climate. Supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, disrupted ocean cycles, and now, humans. Ooh, edgelord saying that humans are a natural disaster. Well, yeah. I mean, from the 4.5 billion year perspective of Earth, we are just another thing that happened. We are just another in a long string of events that upset the balance in the atmosphere and caused it to change. We didn't mean to do it any more than a volcano meant to do it. And if it wasn't us, it would probably be something else, eventually. So if we really want to survive long term on this planet, and I mean long term, it seems like it would behoove us to find a way to, stabilize things. So what if we could regulate the climate? Just like a thermostat on your wall, just imagine a big dial that you could just turn to raise and lower the CO2 level in the atmosphere to always keep it at just the right temperature. What would that look like? How would that work? Exactly what would it take to create a true global thermostat? So if we're going to create this whole system to keep the CO2 levels of the atmosphere in an optimal range, we need to first decide on what that optimal range is. So whenever they talk about CO2 levels, they always compare it to pre-industrial levels, because that was before we started, digging stuff out of the ground and burning it and putting it up in the atmosphere to run everything. Granted, yes, we had been burning stuff to heat our homes and buildings and stuff for a long time, but it was the industrial age that really kicked it into overdrive. And they consider the industrial age to be between 1760 and 1840, so basically before the mid-1700s. And that level is 280 parts per million. Although the argument could be made that there's a better number. I mean, just because that's where it was before doesn't mean it's actually the best optimal thing for, giving us better crop yields and better efficiencies and whatnot. I mean, one could argue that if we made it way lower, then, the poles might freeze over, causing more ice to go up to the poles, causing the ocean levels to go down and create all kinds of new real estate property in a few 100,000 years at least.
It's free real estate.
Of course, that also means that those massive ice sheets would cover up a large part of, North America and Europe and stuff. So that would probably take away as much land as it creates. Anyway, scratch that. We know that 280 parts per million did us well for a long time. It kept the climate stable. We did well in it. It keeps the ocean levels where we want them. We could probably even go up to 300, 310 or so and be okay. So for the purposes of this thought experiment / mega project idea thing, that's our thermostat setting. That's what we're going for. So that means we're gonna have to pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. So how are we gonna do that? So I've covered carbon sequestration methods before. I'll link to the video here. There's a lot of different ways of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, everything from planting forests to regenerative agriculture to construction materials that absorb CO2 out of the air to seeding oceans with minerals to algae and seaweed, all of which are things that we should be doing, most of it anyway. But for the purposes of this video, I'm talking about carbon capture. So yeah, okay, here we go. Here's the deal. Look, a lot of people really don't like the idea of carbon capture, and for some very valid reasons. So let's just talk about those reasons real quick, just get it out of the way, just right off the bat. First of all, there's a couple of different things that get conflated quite a bit. There's direct air capture and carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. CCS collects carbon capture at the source. So like a coal plant, instead of just pumping that smoke up into the smokestack and into the air, they feed it through, basically a carbon dioxide filter. And then that CO2 is sequestered in some way, maybe pumped underground or liquefied into tanks, all that kind of stuff. So CCS doesn't reduce the carbon that's already in the air. It's an emissions mitigation strategy. And the fossil fuel companies love this because it means that they can just keep on burning fossil fuels. They've been lobbying hard for it. It's a nice little loophole so they can keep making as much money as possible. But for something they love so much, they do a really crappy job with it. Yeah, Climate Town did a video about this recently. It's worth a watch. It's actually a great video. But they point out how we threw all this tax money at these coal companies, and only 1 out of 8 projects worked, at all. And even that just barely. If you haven't heard of Climate Town, you should check it out. It's a good show. The only problem I have with it is he's way funnier than me, and how dare he. Turns out, and nobody could have predicted this, but you can't rely on the fossil fuel companies to do the right thing. They're just not going to. Was that smarmy enough? I think that nailed it, yeah. So rightfully, climate change activists hate this idea because the fossil fuel companies use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. I think it's the right idea. I mean, obviously it's better to capture it than just releasing it. Like how we're just pumping this stuff into the atmosphere still is just beyond me, but I get the argument. But either way, that's not what we're talking about today because that just prevents the carbon dioxide from getting into the air, if it works at all. If we want to actually pull carbon out of the air that's already up there, we need to talk about the other option, direct air capture. This is where they collect the air in these giant fans and actually remove the CO2 from the air. And this isn't exactly universally beloved either. Some use the same argument against this as they use against CCS, that it just gives fossil fuel companies permission to just keep, pumping more into the air. And plus, a lot of companies pay carbon credits to direct air capture companies as a bit of a smokescreen to just prevent themselves from, transitioning to cleaner technologies. Plus, a lot of these capture methods are very, very energy intensive, which that itself could leave a carbon footprint. All valid criticisms, and I totally get that, but there is one really good counter argument, which is, we done f***ed up. Earlier I mentioned that 280 to 300 parts per million goal that we're going for here. Well, in case you're wondering what it is now, it averaged at 417.2 this last year. Peaked at 421. That is 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. Even scarier though is that it was higher than last year's, which was higher than the years before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. And it's not just getting higher, it's getting higher in increasingly larger amounts. When they first started tracking CO2 levels in 1958, it was climbing about 1 part per million per year. Today it's closer to 2 per year. In other words, our CO2 emissions have not only not gone down, or even flattened out, they're still going up. And they're going up at accelerating levels. For all the greening we've done, we are nowhere near handling this. Don't get me wrong, we've made a lot of progress in cleaning up our energy infrastructure, and that's great. But in the words of Winston Wolfe,
well, let's not start sucking each other's dicks quite yet.
We've got a long way to go. In fact, we are currently going in the wrong direction, and we just keep pressing the gas harder. This idea that I'm proposing, this whole global thermostat thing, it's absurd. I'll be the first to say it. It's totally absurd. But what we're doing right now is every bit as absurd. I'll tell you what's absurd. Spending millions of dollars on giant machines to take carbon out of the air when you could just use trees. It's like that time when NASA spent millions of dollars on a zero-G pen and then the Russians just used a pencil. Okay, that pencil thing, that was a total fabrication. That actually never happened. But the trees thing, I'm actually glad you said something. You know it's made out of trees. Pencils. So here's the deal with trees. Trees are great. We should be planting them. And yes, they take in CO2, but they also need water. And some places are a little low on water these days. Forests take up land and resources away from agriculture, which we're going to need to feed 8 billion people in the coming years. Forests need to be managed to prevent forest fires, and when trees die, which they will eventually die, the wood releases CO2 when it rots, or catches fire and burns down your hometown. Not to mention that when we plant trees, we tend to plant rows upon rows of single varieties of trees, which creates a monoculture that's extremely vulnerable to fungal infections and disease and blight. All of which is to say, yes, of course, we need to be planting trees, but they aren't a panacea. And besides, they're a one-way street. It's not like a dial you can turn to adjust the climate when things go sideways, which is kind of the whole point of this thought experiment. Is there any other place you can be, buddy? Fine, I guess I'll go draw something. You do that. With my Russian space pen. They didn't use a pencil, the shavings floated around, it got in a thing as short, whatever, he's gone. Anyway, there are 3 major players in the direct air capture space. Carbon Engineering out of Canada, Climeworks in Switzerland, and a company out of Colorado named, Global Thermostat. Bastard stole my title. All of these companies use a similar process to capture carbon out of the air. First, air is pulled in by giant fans. That air then flows through a carbon dioxide absorbent material. That material is then processed, the CO2 is removed, and it's either stored away or used in various products or industries. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds on how all of these companies do what they do. They're all kind of variations on a theme. What really matters is the price per ton of CO2 that they remove and then what they do with it. So let's start with Climeworks. So Climeworks is headquartered in Switzerland, but they've been building plants in Iceland to take advantage of geothermal energy there. Which is something that does need to be talked about a little bit here, because these plants are going to need to be powered by renewable energy. Otherwise, they're basically just going to be burning so much fuel to power this that it's going to defeat the purpose. We'll get back to that in a minute. Climeworks pumps the CO2 they capture underground where it mineralizes with basalt rock. They do this through a partnership with a company called CarbFix, and it's paid for by companies, governments, and individuals purchasing carbon credits. So if, say, you had an international flight and you wanted to offset the emissions from that flight, you could just pay Climeworks and they would just pull it out of the air and pump it underground. Just saying. They opened their first commercial DAC plant in Iceland in September of 2021. It's able to remove 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. They're currently building a new plant that will be able to remove 36,000 tons per year. They plan to get that number up into the millions by 2030 and get up to $1 billion per year by 2050. Price-wise, Climeworks is in the $600 per ton range. They're projecting they could get it down to $200 per ton by the mid-2030s as they scale up. Carbon Engineering is based out of Squamish, British Columbia, Canada. They first started capturing in 2015. They have 2 pilot plants in BC currently capturing around 2,000 tons per year. They sell carbon offsets like Climeworks and store that underground, but they also sell their CO2 on the market to places like soda companies as well as to make synthetic fuel. Those, of course, wind up going back into the atmosphere eventually, making them more carbon neutral than carbon negative. They also have a giant plant in the works here at the Permian Basin in Texas that's expected to pull about 1 million tons per year out of the air, which sounds great. But one of the uses they have for that CO2 is enhanced oil recovery. Yeah, this is where they pump CO2 into oil reservoirs and then use that to force more oil out of the ground, which will then be burned and put into the atmosphere. They also use natural gas as an energy source, which isn't great. Right now, they're operating also at around $600 per ton, but they've been on record saying that they think they could get it down to $100 per ton. As for global Thermostat, they built a few pilot plants for direct air capture in California and Chile. They've got 2 commercial plants under construction in Oklahoma right now, but all of these are in the very early stages. They've actually hit some business and legal snags along the way. I don't need to get into the details, but they just had a bit of a rough start. These 2 Oklahoma plants are also going to be powered on natural gas and are expected to pull 2,000 tons per year each, so 4,000 total. And it looks like they plan on selling their CO2 to create CO2-based fuel, and also for agricultural purposes, greenhouses and such. I couldn't find their current cost per ton, but they advertise they'll eventually be able to get it to $100 per ton, maybe even $50 at scale. I have a skeptical. Of these 3, I think the Climeworks model is really the only one that'll serve the purposes of this thought experiment / mega project because it is 100% powered by renewable energy, it sequesters away 100% of the carbon it captures, and it doesn't put it back into the atmosphere or use it to dig more oil out of the ground. But with new climate policies and pressure on organizations to offset their carbon emissions, a ton of money is flowing into this space, which has, of course, bred a lot of new startup companies with their own takes on direct air capture, including Heirloom Carbon, Mission Zero, Sustera, Noya, and Carbon Infinity. These companies all have different ways of absorbing the CO2. For example, there's a company that's creatively called Carbon Capture that's trying to lower costs by using molecular sieves. Others are focusing on manufacturing small, modular, and easily deployable DAC units, which can maybe bring down the cost for the end users. One company, it's kind of interesting, it's called Carbon Collect. They're building what they call mechanical trees that passively pull carbon from the air with no need for pumps or fans. It was developed at Arizona State University, and they just basically stack hundreds of thin plates with absorbent material on it, and then just let air flow over it for several hours, and then they pull the plates back down, and then pull the CO2 off of it, somehow. They call this passive direct air capture, or PDAC, and it should greatly reduce the amount of energy needed to do this, which is a good thing. They say that a cluster of 12 trees could remove 1 ton of CO2 per day. But the one I've been excited about for a while now is a company called Verdox, which was spun off from an MIT lab that developed this technology that they call electroswing. They basically run air over plates coated with nanotubes that when you run a specific current through it, it attracts CO2 molecules. Once you've captured all of it that you can capture, all you have to do to release the CO2 is turn off the current. And then you pump that CO2 out, start the process all over again. This works at ambient temperature, no need to heat it to several hundred degrees, and there's no moving parts outside the air pump. In April of last year, they were one of 15 participants in the Carbon Capture X Prize to win the $1 million milestone award. I think that was out of like 1,300 entries or something like that. But anyway, the winner will be picked this year, and they'll get an $80 million grand prize. The only real caveat with this technology is that the nanotubes are still expensive to produce, but they believe that at scale they'll be looking at about $50 per ton. And I'm more likely to believe these guys on that price point. I think this technology could pull that off, especially once things scale up, and especially as carbon markets mature. So when I say carbon markets, there's a couple of things I'm talking about here. One is the carbon credits and carbon offsets like Climeworks deals with, I was talking about a second ago. The other is actually selling carbon dioxide to industries for use in products. As governments around the world are trying to stick to the various climate agreements like the Paris Accords, they have begun incentivizing industries to reduce their carbon emissions. This can be through carrots or sticks, depending on the country. So the businesses have a choice. They can either reduce the amount of emissions they release, which requires a lot of retooling and adaptation and, effort, or they can just pay a carbon offset to a carbon-friendly company. And yes, this is something that Tesla benefited from for quite some time. It's kind of like how for years there the car companies got around fuel efficiency standards by creating one half-assed electric compliance model instead of, actually making their cars more efficient. The interesting thing about that analogy is that eventually electric cars became popular and it hit a tipping point. Now it's kind of taking over the industry. Maybe we'll see a similar thing in carbon capture? Who knows? What we're seeing right now in carbon capture is definitely analogous to the lame half-assed electric cars from the past, that's for sure. But anyway, the trend of offsetting emissions through carbon capture is only accelerating, which is why you're starting to see so many startups getting into the space. Now, the other side of the carbon markets, the bottling of CO2 and selling it to industries, this is all over the map. In terms of locking down CO2 and taking it out of the atmosphere, the worst of these options are the enhanced oil recovery I just talked about a second ago, because it's actually enabling more CO2 to go into the atmosphere. Not quite as bad are things like syn fuels and carbonation for sodas. Again, these will go right back into the atmosphere at some point, but it's still more mitigation than sequestration. Then you've got CO2 for agricultural use in greenhouses to grow food and trees and stuff like that. This relies on a lot of factors, including what happens to the plants when that are grown with it, how the waste from the people and the animals who consume it is handled, how tightly the CO2 is managed. There's a lot of escaping into the air again, that kind of thing. And there's also CO2 for algae growth and production, which could be used for fuels or plastics or all the stuff that we normally use oil for. Maybe the best use in my mind, I like this anyway, is using CO2 to cure certain types of concrete. So you're essentially just locking the CO2 down in our homes and buildings. The problem with all these solutions is that it's just not economically feasible. Not when, using CO2 from fossil fuel extraction is orders of magnitude less expensive. So until we find some kind of killer application of CO2, some new application that makes it actually cheaper to use the stuff that's captured from the air, this will remain relatively niche. Now, having said that, there are a lot of research facilities and startups working on new applications of CO2. In fact, there's a whole different X Prize that's set up around it. So maybe in the next decade or so, maybe there's hope that this could become a major way to offset the cost of direct air capture, make the whole thing cheaper. But in the meantime, I think we're just going to have to rely on the capture of CO2 as a publicly funded, government incentivized program. Yeah, I don't like it either. Regardless, tons of money is flowing into the carbon capture space. In April of last year, payment processor Stripe, Google parent Alphabet, Meta, Shopify, and McKinsey announced that they were teaming up to commit to purchase almost $1 billion worth of carbon dioxide removal from companies that are developing this technology. A couple days later, Chris Sacca's climate investment company Low Carbon Capital announced a $350 million fund to invest in carbon removal startups as well. So, with all of that in mind, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be somewhat optimistic and use the long-term cost per ton of CO2 capture at $50. And just to get ahead of the naysayers here, what we're talking about here is a very long-term, multi-generational mega project. Yes, it will take some time, maybe decades, to get down to $50, but at this scale, I think you'd actually see it go down below that in the long run. So for our purposes here, I'm going with it. That's my rationale. So, finally, let's run the numbers. First, let's figure out how much carbon we need to take out of the atmosphere. Now, according to a couple of references I found, links down below of course, every part per million of Earth's atmosphere is 7.81 gigatons, or 7.81 billion tons. So if we're currently averaging around 417 parts per million of CO2, and we want to get that down to, let's just say an even 300, that's 117 parts per million times 7.81, which gives us 913.77 gigatons, or 913.77 billion tons we need to remove. At our $50 per ton price point, that's 45.68 trillion. For the record, at our current rate of $600 per ton, that's $548.26 trillion. So, here's hoping all those investments bring down that cost quickly. But we don't have to spend that all at once. Like I said, this is a very long-term project that will be spread out over time. So with that, our total of 45.68 trillion over 10 years would be $4.56 trillion per year. Over 20 years, $2.28 trillion per year. Over 50 years, $913 billion a year. And if we want to go full out 100 years, it'd be about $456 billion a year. Now for perspective, the total world GDP in 2021 was 96.51 trillion, so this would equal about 1% of global GDP every year if we do it at the 50-year level, or about 0.5% if we do it for the next 100. This seems surprisingly feasible. Like in my head, I'm comparing it to the solar shades video I did a while back where I talked about, launching a bunch of solar shades to the L1 Lagrange point to cool the planet, and that came out to like quadrillions of dollars. I was expecting this to be something like that. Also, that one relied on technologies that don't currently exist, but this one, all the technologies do exist. They're in their infancy and they need to be massively scaled, but they are doable. Now, I am leaving something out in all of those equations and math and stuff. This is all to get rid of the excess CO2 that we've already put in the atmosphere. But like I said before, we're still putting in excess 1 to 2 parts per million into the atmosphere every year. So we also need to account for that. If we average that 1 to 2 parts per million to 1.5 parts per million, that would equate to about 11.7 billion tons per year, which at $50 per ton would be about $587 billion per year just to break even. Okay, so to fill out the rest of that chart, 45.68 trillion total plus 585 billion yearly for a break even over 10 years would come out to about 5.14 trillion per year, or 5.3% of global GDP. Over 20 years is 2.86 trillion tons per year, which equals 2.96% of GDP. Over 50 years, that's 1.49 trillion per year, or 1.54% of GDP. And over 100 years, that's 1.04 trillion per year, or 1.07% GDP. A couple of pedantic caveats here: that GDP number will change over time, most likely go up, so the percentage of GDP would actually go down. Or you could just peg it to a certain percentage of GDP to account for inflation over time. So it's somewhat feasible, but still, this is still like $1 trillion a year, right? So who's gonna pay for that? Now, I know some of you may be saying that we should make the fossil fuel companies pay for it, because, you know, all the reasons, but the fact of the matter is, well, actually they totally could. According to World Bank data, the oil industry profits roughly $3 billion per day and has made between $1 to $2 trillion a year for the last 50 years since 1970, adjusted for inflation. But I mean, we've seen how they handle CCS. Like I said earlier, they're not gonna do the right thing, ever. As much as we may want to punish them, if it's gonna work, the only way that it's gonna go forward is if the governments of the world pay for it. But you might say, nobody's gonna get behind that. 1 or 2% of the entire global GDP, that's a massive amount of money. No government is gonna be okay giving away that much money to some industry, right? Well, it turns out there is precedent for this. Yes, there's a good example, a modern day example of an industry that gets subsidized to the tune of trillions of dollars every year. Can you guess what it is? It's the oil industry. Yes, according to the International Monetary Fund, global fossil fuel subsidies added up to $5.9 trillion in 2020, accounting for 6.8% of GDP, and expected to climb to 7.4% by 2025. Yes, this industry that has profited $1 to $2 trillion per year for 50 years is currently just being given $6 trillion a year by the governments of the world. Just for being such swell guys. So yeah, the money's there if we really want to do this. And I have to take a second to make the same point that I always make whenever people complain about how much money is spent on space. This money isn't just thrown down a hole somewhere and disappears forever. That money goes to companies who use it to pay their employees, who use that money to provide for their families, and they put it into the economy and so on. It's just as likely that this would create an economic boon than the opposite. There's also the argument that not doing this would cost more down the long run because, you know, sea level rise starts ravaging coastal cities. I mean, really, how much would it cost to move Miami? And 570 other coastal cities with a combined population of over 800 million people. So, how do we actually do this?
This is how we do it.
So the cool thing about these direct air capture plants is you can kind of put them anywhere, but some places are better than others. Because like I said before, it doesn't really matter where you pull the CO2 from. What does matter is where you get the energy to pull the CO2 and what you do with the CO2 once you've captured it. Like, there's a reason Climeworks picked Iceland as a place to set up shop with their plants, because there's a ton of geothermal energy there, and volcanic activity has left plenty of underground structures to pump the CO2 and mineralize it. Around the world, there are dozens of geothermal hotspots like Indonesia, the Philippines, Turkey, New Zealand, Mexico, Italy, the aforementioned Iceland, and believe it or not, the top producer of geothermal in the world, the United States. Geothermal is especially good for powering direct air capture plants because it's carbon-free. That's, you know, what's the point of capturing carbon if you have to make more of it to do it? And you can directly use that heat in the processing of the CO2. And I don't think this gets talked about nearly enough, but drilling geothermal wells could provide jobs for dispossessed oil workers. So as our infrastructure changes, there'll be a lot less, they took our jobs, and a lot more, they gave me a new job. And of course, you can get clean power from these plants for hydroelectric sources, and there's always wind and solar. The problem with wind and solar, of course, is it's intermittent. That doesn't really matter as much in this case, but it's also going to take some pretty big wind and solar farms to power these plants. That takes up a lot of land, as did the cost, but it might be worth it if it's at locations with good storage potential. And we are going to need to store a lot of carbon. And not every geothermal source is going to have the right combination of underground spaces made up of the right kind of rock for mineralization of that carbon and so forth. So we're going to need to find as many of these places as possible and build plants nearby, because we certainly don't want to be transporting the CO2 all over the place in gas-burning trucks and ships. Again, defeating the purpose. Now there is one gigantic place where we could probably easily store all this CO2. It's not without its controversy, but it absolutely could work. It's the bottom of the ocean. I talked a little while back about limnic eruptions and how if a lake is deep enough, the carbon dioxide can actually get trapped and pressurized under the weight of all the water above it, essentially carbonating the water. And in the case of lakes like Nyos and Manoon, this pressure can overturn and all that carbon dioxide can escape in an explosion. But oceans are so big that there's very little chance of that happening. Still, it's not great for the sea creatures and ecosystems that live down there. Carbon dioxide, once it gets carbonated, it creates carbonic acid that can eat away at shells and disrupt ecosystems and stuff. And this in turn could eventually affect some of the sea life that we rely on. But if we're okay with it, it's, sacrificing some of that, it is an intriguing idea. You could create a floating plant powered by solar panels and maybe even wave power that passively or lightly fans air through the electro-swing absorbers. The clean air gets pumped out, the CO2 gets pumped way down to the bottom of the ocean where the pressure locks it away and eventually mineralizes it on the ocean floor. These can be made modular and eventually autonomous, so they can be made as big as we need them and they can be kept away from shipping lanes. Could work. There are, of course, a few caveats. Like, we can start with my little modular ocean capture idea there. The ocean is notoriously brutal on things like that. The constant wear and tear from the waves, the storms it would have to contend with, not to mention ocean creatures degrading it, barnacles and whatnot. It would require constant maintenance and upkeep, probably pushing its cost way above that $50 a ton figure. And speaking of that $50 per ton figure, it probably doesn't include the storage part of the equation or the transport of that CO2 around to its storage locations, which also would jack up the price. But the increased cost could be counterbalanced by extending out the length of the project. And it can be extended out for as long as we want. I mean, this is meant to be a very long-term solution. This isn't something that we'll be seeing the benefits from immediately. In fact, we might never see this fully come to fruition. It would probably be a couple decades at least before we're even capturing as much as we're releasing every year. There are also other questions like the albedo. Has so much of the ice melted that the Earth will just continue to absorb more heat no matter how much CO2 we capture? Does that mean that the amount we need to capture goes up even more? And there's also the dreaded unintended consequences. I mean, let's be honest, the climate is a chaotic system, and it might respond in ways we don't like. Kind of like plastic surgery. The more you do, the worse it gets. In fact, we could go too far with it, so here's the part that's going to be really controversial. In order to maintain the balance long term, we actually might need to keep burning fossil fuels. Hear me out. If what we're going for here is balance so we don't get hothouse Earth or snowball Earth, then we need to be able, when needed, to put more CO2 into the atmosphere. Remove when we need, add when we need. Well, we can always spin up or spin down our capture machines, but if we need to add more CO2, and we've totally dismantled all fossil fuel use, there could be a problem there. Now, regardless, fossil fuel use is going to go down over the very long term because there's only so much of it. We will eventually run out of it. So maybe if we reach a point where we completely get off fossil fuels, which by the way would require new technology because there's no way we could currently fly a 787 going on battery power right now. Maybe we could scale back the project and let the Earth do its thing. Maybe keeping a minimum amount on standby just in case. Just spitballing. So yes, there are issues, but still, I mean, doesn't this feel like something that we're going to need eventually if we really want to survive into the far future? Like I said at the beginning, this isn't just about fixing the problem that we cause. This is a volatile planet that we live on. There will always be fluctuations and spikes and perturbations messing with the composition of the atmosphere. And we know that the sun is going to get hotter and hotter in the millions and billions of years to come. This is a way to protect ourselves from that as long as possible. And before people talk about moving off of Earth to Mars or somewhere further away from the sun in the far future, wherever we go, we're going to have to terraform that planet to make it habitable. Maybe we should figure out how to do it here first. Because, I mean, that's what we're doing here. We're terraforming Earth. So why not start now? Because, I mean, as we all know, humans are really good at planning long term. Which is how we got into this situation in the first place. So that's the Global Thermostat Project. Probably a total pipe dream that will never happen, because it would require the coordination of hundreds of countries that all hate each other and can't plan past the next election. But yeah, But yeah, the solar shades idea that I did, that was a total Hail Mary idea, and the more I researched it, the more ridiculous and impossible it was. But this one is actually possibly feasible. I mean, technologically, economically, the only thing holding it back is us. So what do you think? You think it's worth it to really pursue this idea? Or should we just accept the fact that we as a species are a flash in the pan and accept our inevitable doom? I know none of you have any opinions about this. I anticipate a very quiet comment section. And now, I'm gonna get something to eat. Okay, so you guys know that I've done sponsorships with subscription meal boxes in the past, and I will continue to do so because they're awesome. My wife and I love cooking them together. It's a great thing for us. But sometimes when I've just spent the whole day trying to figure out how to terraform planet Earth, I just want to eat something. And at times like that, it's really easy to just hop on the old phone and order some fast food garbage from one of those meal delivery apps. I know, I'm guilty of it too. But it turns out it's a lot faster and easier and healthier and cheaper to just heat up one of these from Factor. Tastes better too. Because these things are actually prepared by professional chefs, so yum, but they also work side by side with dietitians, so you can make sure you get the right number of calories and macros, whatever it is that you're going for. And whatever it is you're going for, they have a variety of meal plans to fit your needs. They've got Calorie Smart if you're cutting calories, Keto if you're cutting carbs, Protein Plus if you're trying to build muscle, as well as veggie options. Oh, and the shakes, hold up. They've got these fruit shakes that are just stupid good. Like it's actually a problem, they're so good. So look, it's still early in the year, maybe you're still working on your resolutions and whatnot. This helps so much, trust me, and it's really good. And of course, they're offering you a deal for watching this video. If you go to factor75.com and enter promo code JoeScott50, you'll get your first box for 50% off. That's like half price. Math. I think you'll be surprised. Honestly, I was. I didn't think I would like it this much. Anyway, again, it's factor75.com, promo code JoeScott50. All the information is in the description box down below. Check it out. I think you'll like it. Okay, I'm back. That was delicious. Big thanks to the Patreon supporters who are helping keep the lights on around here, being great people, forming an awesome community. They actually helped out quite a bit in the researching this video, which I deeply appreciate. I got some new names to shout out here. We've got Austin M. Tabor, Isaac Hutchison, Mark Estano, Old Rasputin, Sean Berman, Ben Curtis, Anthony Gagliano, Mike Garipi, Noala Silver, Samuel French, James A. Higgins, Adam Borton, Charles Vane, Ann King, and Kellen Sutton. Thank you guys so much. If you would like to join them, just go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe and you'll get to do all the things. It'll be cool. Go do it. Have fun. Please do like and share this video if you liked it. And if this is your first time here, maybe check this one out. Maybe I'll link to the Solar Shades video in case you haven't seen it. And you'll see the difference between that idea and this idea. Or you can check out any of the videos in the sidebar if you're watching it on your browser. Thumbnails have my face on them. Please check them out. And if you enjoy them and you're not subscribed, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. But that's it for now. You guys go out there and have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.